I wanted to talk in my lecture about my new book called The Birth of Pleasure, which is now out in Hebrew too, and tell you a little bit about it and how I came to write it. I would start with a story that really encapsulates all the themes, the questions of my book and the themes I'll talk about in this small lecture. And the story comes from Shakespeare's play, The Tempest. And at the beginning of the play, Prospero, who arranges a sea storm to bring his enemies, that is his brother who has usurped his kingdom and other people, to the island where he is living with his daughter. And Miranda, the daughter, says to her father, she's a young girl, adolescent, she says, "If I were a god of any power, I would use my power to stop this." And she says, "What are your reasons for raising this sea storm?" And then he says to her, "Well, what do you remember of life before you came to this island with me?" And she says, "I remember there were women who tended me." And then he tells her his whole story of his reasons for wanting to bring his enemies to the island. And she listens to his whole story. And at the end she says, "But still is beating in my mind your reason for raising the sea storm." At which point he says to her, "Here, cease more questions. 'Tis a good dullness," and puts her to sleep. Uses his powers. So these two questions that she asked her father, why all the suffering and where are the women? These are kind of the foundational questions that led me basically to write Birth of Pleasure. I want to just say what happens in the course of The Tempest is very interesting, because what happens in the course of the play is Prospero, Miranda's father, brings a pageant. He has all these magical powers and he brings a pageant, and goddesses come and they offer her honors, riches, marriage, blessing. Basically, if she will stop her questions and enter this world, this kingdom of her father. And I mean, you have to think of what's the opposite: dishonor, poverty, being alone, curses. And so she basically, she agrees. And at the end of the play, Ferdinand, who will be her husband, says, is playing chess with her. And she says to him, "Sweet Lord, you play me false." And he says, "I would not for all the world." And she says, "For a score of kingdoms," which is what her father had fought for, "you should wrangle, and I would call it fair play." So, first of all, the two questions, why all the suffering and where are the women? And secondly, an initiation process where there are the things that are offered to Miranda if she will now come in and perpetuate this order that she had questioned. These are the questions and really the issues behind my book, Birth of Pleasure. Very quickly, to recapitulate a research project that extended over a period of really 30 years, beginning with my first book. It's interesting, it's like every 10 years I wrote a book that marks kind of the evolution of this research project. But the first book was 1982, and it was in a different voice. And the book was about what had been lost in a tradition that was manifest in the field I was in, which is psychology. What had been lost by the fact that half the population, that is women, were not included in the group that was studied when psychologists wanted to define what is human development. So that, for example, Freud's theories are all from the point of view of the young boy. All of Erickson's studies were of basically, men. Same thing, it was across the field. What had been lost? And the answer, in a different voice, is a world of relationships, of emotions, and of the body, all of which were associated with women and seen to compromise development. If thought was connected to emotion, it was seen as not rational. If the mind was connected to the body, it wasn't sufficiently abstract. And if the self was connected to relationships, it was seen as having a problem with separation. This is really... So that was the theory that In a Different Voice said, bringing in women's voices will illuminate part of human experience which otherwise has been overlooked in the representation. It will change the voice of theory and the way of listening to both women and men. So that was the first book, 1982. Following that, I discovered that while people were talking about women, and the questions that were usually asked about women, I bet you could anticipate. All the questions about women were how much will women like or not like men? You know, I mean, that's one question you could ask. I did not think it was the most interesting necessarily question, but that was the issue. Men were the standard. Were women like men or not like men? If women were different, were women better or worse? Instead, what I noticed was no one had studied girls, so that the psychology of women was cut off from women's life history. And there was no sense of where we had come from. What was our past? What was our own life history? So the second book I published with one of my students, Lynn Michael Brown, was called Meeting at the Crossroads, Women's Psychology and Girls' Development. It was about connecting women's psychology with what you could see as, from a psychologist's point of view, women's history, namely the study of girls' development. And the finding of that study, and in that book, is that girls, when they approach young womanhood, when they approach adolescence, actively resist making a series of splits between mind and body, thought and emotion, self and relationships. And they were resisting, in a sense, they were resisting splits that will lead them to lose their ability to walk surely in the human world, because if you are with 9, 10, 11-year-old girls, they are remarkable readers of the human world. They see what's going on in the family, in the classroom. And with these dissociations, they lose a voice that is anchored in their experience. They lose relationship in the sense of, if they're not saying what they're feeling and thinking, they're not present in their relationship. And they lose their ability to tell their own story accurately. So what I found in the study of girls is that girls, in being initiated into a world which is orchestrated around these splits, begin to rewrite their own history. Just as psychologists have inscribed a culture basically as nature. So we get to the point of the work on girls. This middle phase of my work says, we have been telling a wrong story about human development. And I want to bring in very quickly here the convergence now of research in developmental psychology and in neurobiology that has questioned these long-standing cultural and also gendered splits. And in neurobiology, particularly, the work, I don't know if it's been translated into Hebrew, but of Antonio Damasio, the book Descartes' Error, that the split between thought and emotion is neurologically unfounded, that neurologically we're wired so that our minds, our thinking is connected to our emotions. And he makes a distinction which was really useful to me in thinking about what I was observing, which is girls beginning to not know what they knew. And he distinguishes between what he calls the core self, which is that in our bodies and in our emotions, we register our experience from moment to moment, you know, like a film running inside us, and also our experience of watching the film. This is what is called core consciousness, our awareness of our experience from moment to moment. And leading to both memory and also identity as this extends through time and history. But Damasio, in his book called The Feeling of What Happens, Body and Emotion in the Making of Consciousness, In other words, we are aware of the feeling of what happens, distinguishes this core self from what he calls the autobiographical self, meaning the self which is wedded to a story about itself. And my research was showing that there was an initiation whereby girls were being wed to a false story about themselves. That is a story that really wasn't true. For example, Judy, one of the girls in my study, at 10, begins to tell a story about relationships, which is at odds with what she knows to be true about relationships. She knows from experience that disagreement is a natural, if upsetting, part of relationship. That anytime with two people, there are times when you lose connection with the other people and you have to work through it and repair it. And at 10, she says, you know, my friends and I never fight. You know, we always want exactly the same things and we like exactly the same things, which is she is beginning to tell a story that is not, in fact, representative of her experience. In the course of this middle phase of my work, where girls were absolutely essential, I come across the diary of Anne Frank, and I thought that would be an example that would interest you. And I make a discovery that was astonishing to me. I don't know how many of you know this, but the actual published diary that most of us had read, was not Anne Frank's actual diary, but was her edited version of her diary. And that in the spring of '44, when she hears a radio broadcast saying that the Dutch government in exile has plans after the war to establish a war museum, and they're interested in diaries, letters, and collections of sermons that will show how the Dutch people carried on their lives under the extreme conditions of the war. She, who wanted to be a famous writer, saw that this was her chance. So between May and August of '44, she rewrites 340-something pages of her diary. And then after the war, you know, after Otto Frank survived, he's the only survivor, he comes back, and the helper who gathered up the diary when the Nazis invaded the hiding place, the secret annex, had gathered up all the materials. So there was the actual diary, her edited version of the diary, and then in this volume, which was published by the Netherlands basically what turned out to be the War Museum, they include the first published version of the diary. And Otto Frank basically followed, with a few interesting exceptions, his daughter's editing, presenting her to the world as she wanted to be seen. Now, to me as a psychologist, this was like discovering a fossil in amber. That through this horrendous history, what had been preserved was a voice that usually gets edited out. So what did she edit? I then compared the actual diary to her edited version of the diary. First of all, I just want to say something that was fascinating to me. And as far as I know, no other women, I don't know of any, said in reading the diary, what was presented as the diary, this is an edited voice. In other words, we didn't spot the editing, which is really interesting, which goes along with my sense that we rewrite our history so as to edit out and dismiss a very key voice. So she edits out basically three things. Her own, her observation of her own changing body as she changes from a girl's body to a woman's body. Peter, the son of the other family, who is her friend, and they become, you know, romantically interested in each other, he offers to tell her about her body, and she says, no, I have to look at it myself and find out for myself. And she gives the most exquisite description of a young girl's changing body and emerging sexuality. That you can predict, right? She's trying to edit her diary so that it will pass the scrutiny of who she knows will make decisions about what's led into the War Museum. That is a group of fathers, basically. So that she edits out. The second thing she edits out is her observations of the world and its values as she knows them from what she reads. And she notices the persisting inequalities between women and men, and the silence of women about it, which she says the more women are silent about this, the more deeply entrenched it becomes. So she's noticing the silence of women about persisting inequities. She says men are honored, war heroes are honored, and then she says, but women are just as courageous, giving birth, suffering pain. Then all those, this is a quote from her, freedom-fighting heroes with their big mouths. This is obviously a 14-year-old, right? That's the second thing. The third thing that changes is you probably know from reading the diary about the difficulties between Anne Frank and her mother, the harshness toward her mother, that very critical voice toward her mother, is the voice of the edited version. The actual diary describes a relationship that is under stress. For example, one of the passages she edits out is Margot, that's her sister, Margot, Mommy, and I get into bed together every night. We're thick as thieves. So my question is, why is she editing out her pleasure with her mother and telling this story of alienation and stress? And instead of, in the edited version, instead of describing a relationship under stress, as she presses her mother to speak to her about her mother's experience of living as a woman, in a woman's body, in relationships. And the mother basically says, I don't know, doesn't want to talk about this with Anne. And what Anne is turning on is what she sees as the impediments to actually making connection with her mother, an honest connection, as she becomes a woman. Will her mother talk with her about what she knows about sexuality, about relationships, and living in the world as a woman? The one thing that her father edits out is when Anne writes about how she sees the marriage between her parents, and that she, in fact, doesn't see it as her father wants her to see it. She sees it. It's a passage that's actually most sympathetic to her mother. The Birth of Pleasure, the title of my book, comes from the end of the Psyche and Cupid myth, written in North Africa in the 2nd century. It's a myth of resistance. It's a love story about resisting moves that would lead love to end in tragedy. And this is on the part of a young woman, Psyche, young girl, and Cupid, young man, are going to together find their way out of a tragic story. So it ends, it's a love story that ends with a just and lawful and equal relationship between a man and a woman, and the birth of a daughter named Pleasure. The themes, if I could just summarize quickly, the two themes of Birth of Pleasure is, first of all, we have been caught in a trauma, in a repetition of a tragic, traumatic story. The initiation of girls, which I described, has its parallel in the earlier initiation of boys, which takes place usually more around 5, 6, 7, and so boys' resistance is expressed more in action than in words. And my question was, to go back to my original story from the Tempest, why all the suffering? Why do we keep collectively repeating cycles of trauma and tragedy? Is there some way to break out of that if we have a different understanding now of human development and our neurobiology and our psychology? And secondly, the key role of girls in the resisting, and women, in resisting the repetition of a tragic story and breaking the cycle. Because the initiation of girls occurs later, girls will give voice to a problem that otherwise is felt, but actually not articulated. In that sense, the development of girls and the education of girls becomes a barometer of, I would say, both the health of a society and a barometer of the extent to which a society achieves a vision of being a truly democratic society. And since I wrote The Birth of Pleasure, one of the things I've been involved with is I've adapted The Scarlet Letter, Hawthorne's novel, into a play. Actually worked with my oldest son, Jonathan, on this project. And what interested me is in the middle of the novel Scarlet Letter, which you probably, every American school child has to read this. It's usually, it's read as a story about the wages of sin. Hester Prynne wears a scarlet A because she becomes pregnant outside of marriage. But in the middle, Hawthorne has this passage where he says, the narrator says, "Men of the sword have overthrown nobles and kings." It's about the establishment of democracy. "Men bolder than these, at least in the sphere of theory, have overthrown a whole system of ancient prejudice, which is tied to ancient principles." But Hester Prynne, who's raising a daughter, says that until there is a change in the relationship between men and women, there can't really be realized the vision of a new society that is a democratic society. Because she says what has come to seem through long habit, what has come to seem like nature has to be essentially modified or altered. What has come to be taken as masculinity and femininity has to be altered. And the novel ends with a prophecy that a new truth will be revealed in order to establish the whole relation between man and woman on a sure foundation of mutual happiness. And the tension, which is what I write about in Birth of Pleasure, between democracy on the one hand and patriarchy on the other, as it plays out in the internal world and in the external world, seems to me very much the struggle of our time. So what I wanted to do with my book is offer a map of resistance, of how to get out of a tragic story, and how, using current research in psychology and neurobiology, we really are in a position now to see how and when that story gets internalized, and therefore how you could join what is a healthy resistance.